Very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise in the House today to speak to the motion that the members opposite have put forward. And I will also read the motion as presented, that this Assembly take action to further support for mental health and addictions across the province, but particularly in northern Saskatchewan, where the rates of suicide are alarming and services are extremely limited. Mr. Speaker, while we recognize and respect the motion put forward by the members opposite, the motion also fails to recognize that our government is taking action to increase supports for mental health and addiction services across the province, including the North. While the motion raises an important issue and one our government takes very seriously, we cannot support the motion put forward as the members have put forward. Mr. Speaker, our government is spending $330 million within the Ministry of Health on mental health and addictions. Mr. Speaker, that is an increase of 52% since 2007, since the Saskatchewan Party formed government. Now, Mr. Speaker, I was elected by the residents of Regina Rochdale to speak on their behalf. And does that mean that only the residents of my riding matter to me and their concerns and my concerns? Absolutely not, Mr. Speaker. Each and every one of us is elected, and we should want to do what's best for the whole province. Mr. Speaker, we have family and friends living across the province. And, Mr. Speaker, when they are grieving a loss from suicide or know someone who is suffering from addictions, there is no geographical boundary that separates us. Mr. Speaker, each and every one of us know of someone very close to us who suffers from mental health issues or suffers from an addiction. For way too long, persons who suffer from mental illness suffered in silence, and too many of our friends have lost the battle to addiction. Mr. Speaker, a very good friend of mine, Dave Batters, in 2009, he was my friend, he was my MP, but he was someone who suffered in silence, and he took his life. His wife, Denise Batters, has been very, very vocal in saying we need to do more, but we need to speak out. And I've been very pleased to be able to help her with raising funds for mental health. Because, Mr. Speaker, many of us left behind, we also suffer. We suffer from the loss. We suffer from the guilt. Could I have done more? What could I have done to help? Well, Mr. Speaker, today many people are speaking up, and they're asking for the help they need. And, Mr. Speaker, our government, this government, is listening. That's why we have invested in more funding for more full-time positions in mental health and addictions. As I stated, Mr. Speaker, we have increased the funding by 52% since we formed government. We also have very close family members. My niece, Linda Joan, she suffered from alcoholism, and she died. She left behind my sister-in-law, who was broken-hearted, her children, who were broken-hearted because they lost their mom. I mean, Mr. Speaker, we know that there's communities in the North. We know there's individuals in the North who suffer personally, and our hearts go out to everyone who's lost someone from suicide or mental health issues. But, Mr. Speaker, we are working to make sure that those who require support receive them. The Ministry of Health, Education and Social Services continue to work with our federal and our First Nations partners to make sure that any response to suicide is coordinated, but it's immediately. And the Saskatchewan Health Authority continues to provide support for young people at risk of suicide. They are working with schools, the RCMP, the First Nations bands to identify urgent cases and how best to respond. And the Ministry of Health participates in the Embracing Life Committee, which focuses on building community capacity to prevent suicides. A Northern Training and Resource Registry is being developed so that Northern communities can find the mental health and suicide prevention supports available from all agencies in a single location. Over the past 2 years, the Ministry of Health has provided the former Keewatin Mamawetan health regions with $350,000 in additional funding to support community suicide prevention initiatives. Suicide prevention protocols have been fully implemented in Northern Mental Health and Addiction Services. To date, 93 human service staff have been trained in mental health first aid. 228 have received applied suicide intervention skill training, and 46 have been trained in Safe Talk. The Saskatchewan Health Authority hired a community suicide prevention coordinator to provide ongoing support to the Saskatchewan Health Authority and Mental Health Commission of Canada, our First Nations partners in La Ronge area. Communities across the north are taking initiatives. Just last night in Pinehouse Lake, as many know, my family lives there, 40 members from the community got together. And it was a wonderful meeting, but it was a very emotional meeting. 40 members got together from the community. These are leaders, these are just folks who said, we have to do more. And they were focusing in on discussing the issues of crystal meth in their community. So, Mr. Speaker, these members, they didn't just sit around and complain. They said, let's figure out what do we need to do? Who do we need to work with? Well, they know they need to work with the schools. They know they need to work with their community leaders, the RCMP, the government. But you know who else they decided they needed to work with? They needed to work with the dealers, the drug dealers. They needed to work with the addicts. And Mr. Speaker, after that meeting, do you know what they did? A couple of members from that committee went and they met with one of the meth dealers. And they said to him, what can we do to help you out of this situation? Now, Mr. Speaker, that's positive. That's community leaders taking on an initiative because they know they can't do it by themselves. So what do? They roll up their sleeves and they are working to get the job done. Mr. Speaker, that wasn't the first meeting that community has had. That was the third meeting where members from the community who are concerned, who want a better community, have taken action. They also have taken action by having what they call Recovery Lake, which is a camp which focuses on the addictions of the individual. But they say, you know what, you can't just treat the individual. The whole family is being affected. So what do? The whole family goes to Recovery Lake and they work through the addiction issues together. Mr. Speaker, this is positive initiative, but this is coming from the grassroots, from the communities. What does this mean, Mr. Speaker? It means that people are taking control of their lives. Communities are taking action. And Mr. Speaker, that's why it's so important that our communities like Pinehouse Lake and Sandy Bay have developed critical incident and trauma response teams. Sandy Bay has also opened up a family resource centre focusing on early childhood development. And Lac La Ronge Indian Band is partnering with the Red Cross to develop a community-safe planning and introduce suicide prevention training to the schools in the area. And the Prince Albert Grand Council is providing suicide prevention and support training for teachers, RCMP, and family services worker at Deschambault Lake. Mr. Speaker, our government is focused on how do we help northern communities. Our northern communities have not been overlooked. Mr. Speaker, just this past week, we had a group of students from northern Saskatchewan that were participating in the Charles Knight Student Leadership Program. Mr. Speaker, it's programs like this where students have the opportunity to learn leadership. And through that leadership, they have the opportunity to be mentors to their peers, because we know who best to talk to youth is youth themselves. And Mr. Speaker, this is why programs such as this, the Charles Knight Youth Leadership Program, that's the backbone. That's how we ensure that students who are suffering in silence have the opportunity to seek help. And so that's why, Mr. Speaker, the intention of the motion is good, but it does not fulfill and it does not address the issues that the government has looked at in response to suicide and addictions, and specifically in the North. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.